Hey, superstars, welcome back to another episode of Word Up with Danny Katz. Today I am joined once again by my dear friend, Robert Forte. Robert Forte is an academic, a psychedelic scholar, an author, a publisher, an editor, a multi-dimensional thinker, and he came on the show to talk to us about the psychology of non-perception, which he's been studying for quite a while. It's a super lively conversation. I know you're going to dig it. Before we jump in, I'm reminding you to click that subscribe button, to like, to share, to comment, to click the notification bell so that you can be notified of my every next video drop. And given that I'm hearing whispered rumors of people being unsubscribed from my YouTube or that my YouTube content is being suppressed, your wisest move in staying abreast of my every offering, including my upcoming and last ever pop propaganda homeschool course for teens, is to sign up for my newsletter at dannykatz.com. That ensures that we get to stay in touch regardless of whatever big tech fuckery is on the agenda that day. So as always, the first half of this podcast is free for the public. The second half is available for paid supporters on both my locals and Patreon communities. Those links are below in the comments as well. dannykatz.locals.com, patreon.com/dannykatz, where for as little as $5 a month, you get access to all of my second half conversations. You get oodles of bonus content, including unpublished writings, advance notice of webinars, workshops, live events, special discounts, opportunities to drop in with me one-on-one, as well as our community. So choose the platform of your choice, support me there so that you can access the second half of this conversation and all of my conversations. I think that does it for housekeeping. Buckle up and prepare to enjoy my conversation with Robert Forte on the psychology of non-perception. So, the psychology of non-perception. What are we talking about today? Why are we talking about this? Fill me in.
Well, no, I mean, the psychology of non-perception is just a concept that flew into my head one day when I was riding my bike along West Cliff in Santa Cruz along the Monterey Bay. And I realized it was something that I've been trying to understand pretty much my whole life. Like why and how is it that people don't see the obvious, especially when the obvious is kind of disturbing?
Kind of?
Well, I mean, when I was a little boy, the first thing was this stream that I used to play at. That was my paradise. And then as development grew in our area, the stream became polluted, and the fish and the salamanders and the frogs were dying. But hardly anybody really cared because there were buildings going up, and it was going to reduce the tax rate. But for me, this was a sign that, overdevelopment is ruining the environment, and that we ought to be a little more mindful about the rate that we consume and what's really important. And then, some people got it. Some people were just sort of naturally attuned to deeper realities. And some people were swept away by social conditioning and what was trendy or seemed right, the advertising. And then the psychology of non-perception really jumped into my consciousness in the mid-1980s when I became very interested suddenly in the Kennedy Assassination, which I hadn't ever really looked at carefully until, about 1984 or 5, when somebody showed me a slow motion copy of the Zapruder film. And you can see, obviously, that Kennedy is shot from the front.
Right.
And this is something that had happened just 20 years ago. Like, how is it that we are, as a society, almost completely oblivious to this most, incredible event, a beloved president shot in the face in broad daylight, and nobody's prosecuted for it. This flimsy theory is thrown out, that guy's shot, and it's cleaned up, and then it's gone, and we're going on. I mean, it was obviously a coup d'etat, and people are just completely oblivious to it.
So since you have been examining the psychology of non-perception for such a long time, have you come to conclusions as to why people can't see what seems obvious to a lot of us?
Yeah, so I'm beginning, I'm writing another book now. I'm writing a memoir, and I'm starting to put some meat on these bones of the psychology of non-perception. What are some of the factors that lead to this, to our society being so mind controlled, right? And so the next big event was 9/11, of course. So that's another thing, that we were all just shocked and awed by this dramatic event, disoriented, and then this narrative thrown at us, which was willingly swallowed up by a lot of people, including myself, for the first couple years. And then you pause and you look at it and you realize it makes absolutely no sense at all. But
Wait, so hold up, let's slow down. So you bought into it for the first couple years. What was the first thing or exposure or bit of information that created some doubt and invited a deeper examination?
Well, the first thing for me was a little film called In Plain Sight, where I was able to really examine the video footage of the Pentagon.
Yep.
Seeing that hole in the Pentagon wall could not have been caused by a plane. There was no plane wreckage. The hole was close to the ground. It just suddenly seemed crazy, impossible. And then I began to look into it, and I found so many other things that were obviously impossible. And then facts added up, study, research, the way the buildings come down perfectly symmetrically. That looked to me like a controlled demolition.
But it didn't look like a controlled demolition for the first 2 years when you were buying into it, or were you just not really looking at it that closely?
For me personally, I didn't really look into it that closely for personal reasons. I mean, for me, actually, a family member of mine was involved in the operation, and I was in New York that day.
And involved how?
Well, involved in the financial aspects of it. He told me a couple of days after it happened, we were having dinner in New York, and he said, "We knew this was going to happen." And I said, "You knew this was going to happen?" And he said, "Yes, boys from the government advised our firm." Now, this person, he was my brother-in-law, and he was a senior vice president of a very large asset management company in New York called Alliance Capital Management. And he managed what was called their high yield global hedge fund, a multi-billion-dollar hedge fund of defense and energy stocks and these things. And so he told me that boys from the government advised his firm on matters that pertain to business. And I just, kind of went in one ear and out the other. I was just beginning a relationship with a very special woman, and I mentioned it to her, and she kind of dismissed it. And I was involved in negotiating a film deal for my Leary book, and I just decided I wasn't going to go into those conspiracies for now. I was going to make a movie. And so I didn't even talk about it. And whenever anybody mentioned it to me, and this will get back to the psychology of non-perception, when anybody mentioned it to me like, "Oh, it was an inside job, it was a controlled demolition," I would say, "Stop, that's too outrageous, couldn't possibly be, don't even bring stuff like that. It makes, serious political analysis more difficult to do. Forget that."
Well, wait, hold up. I'm curious to know how you rectify that, because at that point, it sounds like you had already started to question the Kennedy assassination story. So why was that conspiracy open for exploration, but the other one not?
Well, again, it wasn't totally rational on my part. It was, I spent several years reading just about every book there was on the Kennedy assassination, and it's really kind of it's kind of a thankless task. You know, you become alienated from your community. I was very involved, as you know, in the psychedelic work, and you know, made a shift into political consciousness. And my friends, my colleagues in the psychedelic world, academics that I approached to do a PhD on this concept would say like, oh no, you know, you're a conspiracy, you'll be labeled a conspiracy theorist. And I was a victim to some of these techniques that were going to explicate of the psychology of non-perception. Why are people so adverse to seeing something that's obvious?
Yep.
And so, yeah, I was a victim of that. Like I said, I was involved in a really special relationship with a really special person. We were madly in love, and her father was high up in the FBI, and she just didn't like political conspiracies. And so I just decided to leave that aside for a couple years until we split up.
Do you ever look back on that and wonder at the coincidence of like, wow, I started dating a woman whose father was an FBI insider around the same time that I started to question this narrative that was being used to enslave Americans?
Yes, I look at all these things. It's crazy. It gets even crazier than that, because this particular woman who became my partner is actually a very famous movie star. And she's especially famous for her leading role in Raiders of the Lost Ark, which is a movie, as you must know, about the Nazis' acquisition of occult power and mind control in this thing. So we had connected, and you know, that was another part of it when I look back on this. Plus the fact that my brother-in-law, who had confided and blurted out that he knew, I was offered a job in that same major Wall Street when I graduated from college. So there were all these, you know, it's like destiny for me to sort out all these levels of intrigue and interest in it. And so, you know.
Do you ever wonder if, given, because before that you'd been questioning the JFK, you'd been heavily steeped in the psychedelic movement and the psychedelic community, did it ever occur to you that you might be being handled by these people who appeared in your life at this time?
No, I think I might have been handled a bit in the psychedelic work. I'm still trying to understand that better. I mean, the primary instigator of my work in the psychedelic world was a man named Frank Barron. Was involved with the CIA in ways that are still not quite clear to me. And he prodded me when I was in my last year of college to do this, to basically restart the psychedelic movement. He was a very close friend of Timothy Leary, and he made introductions for me and asked me to organize a conference where I brought together all these people. And then I was invited down to Esalen, where I worked very closely with Stan Groff for a long time. And then I was led up to meet Alexander Shulgin, who was taught me and my friends how to make MDMA. And I was part of the whole early propagation of that. So I wonder about that. And unfortunately, Frank died in 2002. And so I never really got a chance to dig out. That was before I really got into the greater extent of MK Ultra that you and I have talked about.
Right.
So, you know, it's still a complicated story that's not entirely clear to me to what extent I was handled. But I don't think that I think that I started to break out of this matrix right around 9/11, when I realized, oh my God, you know, how incredibly corrupt and extensive the corruption is in our society. And it was, you know, it sent me into a real tailspin. I have to admit, you know, I was really depressed for a couple of years, seriously depressed, and alienated from a whole community, from my family. And that's another aspect of this. Like, why are they unable, or why do they refuse to see the obvious? Is because sometimes it can be very, it can be very lonely. It can isolate you. It's terrifying.
Yeah.
And So let me like go back a little bit and talk about some of the kind of psychological aspects
Okay.
that help us understand the psychology of non-perception. And I don't know if you and I have ever discussed the research of a man named Solomon Asch. Have
No,
we?
I don't think so.
Okay, so this is extremely important. Solomon Asch was a Jewish Polish refugee of Poland in the late 1930s who came over here to the United States to resume his career as a psychological researcher. Mm-hmm. And the official story is that he was appalled at the way his Polish countrymen and women kind of fell in line with the Third Reich, and that came to America and thought that the American spirit of independence would make us immune to this sort of conformity. And so he designed these really very brilliant experiments, which anybody that's taken a Psych 101 class will recognize them probably. And so, they're the famous Solomon Asch conformity experiments. They gave birth really to the whole field of social psychology in the United States, beginning in the mid-late 1930s. So here's what Asch did. Imagine that you're in college and somebody comes up to you and says, invites you to take part in an experiment, saying it's a test of your visual acuity. And we'll give you $5. And you say, sure. And so you're led into a room where there are 19 other people. Now you think these 19 other people are just like you, brought in off the street to have their eyesight tested, but really they're confederates in the experiment. Mm-hmm. You're the only one that's being studied here. Okay. And so Solomon Asch goes to the blackboard and he draws 4 lines. One line is 8 inches, one line is 12 inches, one line is 10 inches, one line is 4 inches. And you are asked to say which 2 lines are the same length. The answer is obvious and unambiguous. Mm-hmm. This line is 8 inches and that line is 8 inches. He goes around the room, he asks everybody. Everybody gives the wrong answer. Now it's your turn. What do?
I give the right answer, but I'm used to being the pariah.
So when I say it like this, that's what everybody says, that they would defy the group and give the right answer. Mm-hmm. But actually, when Solomon Asch did this, and I believe the first time he did this was at Swarthmore College, which is, a super elite college, 75 to 80% of the people defy their own senses and give the wrong answer in order to conform to the group. So this experiment has been replicated countless times, thousands of studies, different versions of it, but that's pretty much what they get, that 15 to 30% of the people will rather conform to a group than say the truth. Now that's rather extraordinary. So that's the first thing.
Hold up. I'm curious to know, in terms of Solomon Asch's research, was there something wrong with these people? Is there some sort of traumatic wound we can point to that has maligned these people's sense of integrity or what is right? Or is this just baseline humans are gross?
These were the best and the brightest. Like I said, Asch began these experiments at Swarthmore.
Right.
I believe he went on to Yale.
In what year?
Late 1930s it started.
This is why I'm asking, because I spent a brief period of time studying the art coming out of Japan, which is all very cartoonish and kind of S&M kitty cats. And what I realized was this culture has a wound called Hiroshima that has them seeking out the comfort of like soft, fluffy animals, or, you know, because there's this giant wound. So that's what I'm wondering, if there was like something similar or comparable to the American psyche that we can point to that inspired this response, or if it's just humans' baseline setting.
Well, these are great questions, and to really drill into them would be a long study, and that's again what the history of Solomon Asch's research is.
Got it.
I will say this, that you know, as I already said, that these were the best and the brightest at the finest universities, Ivy League, and it was actually these studies that helped inspire one of the major psychedelic movements of the 20th century. So Frank Barron, who I mentioned, was my mentor, my dear friend and teacher, who I trusted and loved, and he was interested in the 10 to 15% who didn't conform.
Right.
Made them different.
Yeah.
And so he devoted his career to this. And he did psychological profile. He was one of the leading personality psychologists of the last century. And he wanted to figure out why those people didn't conform and how to make more of those people. He found that there were significant differences in their worldview.
Okay.
For instance, the people who were the non-conformers were believed that nature was benevolent. Their basic worldview was that nature was friendly, versus the conformers, who had a sense of like the hostility of nature. So this might get into your question about trauma.
Yep.
They had basically kind of a fear-based orientation to reality. And so maybe they needed the comfort of the group. They were more outer directed. They looked to institutions and leaders for the sense of authority, whereas the creative people, the non-conformers, had more of a confidence in themselves and in nature.
And I just want to ask about what you just said. You said the creative people, the non-conformers. So was that another link that he made, that the non-conformers were more creative than the conformers?
Yes, that's right. In fact, that became really the focus of Frank Barron's career. He's well known as one of the foremost researchers into the psychology of creativity.
Got it.
What makes creative people not just artists, but creative in every endeavor. Okay.
Right.
So it was actually, so he began to interview creative people and just find out things about their worldview. And eventually he was on a study, had gone down to Mexico to study a group of expatriate writers. And that's when he learned of the psychedelic mushroom.
Okay.
In the late 1950s, and he took it.
Okay.
He thought that he had discovered the Holy Grail, that this was the thing that could shift that perspective from nature being hostile to nature being friendly. Shift the locus of authority. Like once you have a very profound mystical experience, psychedelic or otherwise, you learn, you have a great respect for the power of your own consciousness, right, and be more inner directed kind of thing. And so that was his incentive. And that was the basis that he turned on his best friend, Timothy Leary, and why they started that project at Harvard.
Okay, cool.
Yeah. So that's one part of it.
It's above righteousness and justice.
I not only wrote the book on propaganda, I teach a course on propaganda, specifically for teens. The course is called Pop Propaganda. We focus on the propaganda coming through social media, news, pop music, advertisement, activism. If there's propaganda coming through media, we're going to talk about it in my Pop Propaganda course for teens.
It's above righteousness and justice. And it involves the principle that human nature is a fundamentally good arrangement.
So there's the Asch conformity studies is one of the real pillars of the psychology of non-perception.
Mhm.
And you can see this enacted when you look at the way the media handled the Kennedy assassination. This is where, you must know, the weaponization of the phrase conspiracy theorist comes from. We've seen the CIA manual where they say, people are starting to disbelieve the Warren Commission. What are we supposed to do? And they said, well, the first thing you do is you ridicule them. Humans are so very susceptible to ridicule, being ostracized and laughed at. And so that's how the phrase conspiracy theorist gets weaponized.
Right.
In the media, you can see, oh, you're one of those, one of those people. Okay. So
super effective. Like, I gotta give the CIA props for that one. It really has legs. Like, here we are, 60 years later, and people are still using the phrase conspiracy theorists to mock people and to shut down discourse.
No, it's really incredible. I mean, before 1964, a conspiracy theorist was an attorney, was a sociologist. It was a person who approached complex sociological or political events with a scientific method.
Mm-hmm.
Where you look at data, you come up with a theory, and then you try to prove it.
Right.
And they flip that around. Oh yeah, the psychological sophistication of the social engineers in the CIA and Tavistock Institute and British MI6 and Mossad, that's not just CIA, the social engineering operation is multinational, as we know. Let's just not pick on the CIA here.
Right.
And it's also, let me go back a little bit. I found this out later. Those Solomon Asch studies were funded by the Office of Naval Intelligence.
Whoa, okay, now we got to really slow down, because naval intelligence is like the crux of evil military secret ops. So what do we do with that? Like, 5 seconds ago, I was all into the Solomon Asch studies. Now that you're telling me this?
Yeah. So I'm just sharing some of my kind of confusion about this, because when I have an undergraduate degree in experimental social psychology, and I was told, as I began the story, that Asch was curious, thought that Americans wouldn't be susceptible.
Right.
And they began these studies. But then I learned just, a few years ago that they were funded by the Office of Naval Intelligence. And now I'm wondering if they were just kind of market testing to see what they could actually get away with.
1,000%.
Yeah, and let me just jump forward here and bring up our dear friend Bobby Kennedy, because in his great book on Anthony Fauci, he mentions some of these similar studies in the field of social psychology. The famous Stanley Milgram studies,
Mm-hmm.
shocking.
Yep.
Subjects just applied very harmful, potentially fatal electric shocks to their fellow students.
Right.
Because an authority told them to do that. Bobby Kennedy points out that those studies were also conducted at Yale and were funded by the CIA. And so this...
Okay, because this calls the whole thing into question.
It calls a great deal of the whole enterprise of modern American psychology into question. Yes, is that what you mean?
Yeah, but it also calls into question, like, what is the purpose and the intention of these? It just feels like, yeah, they're trying to figure out how they can snow the public and how much they can get away with. Like we've just seen with the pandemic being like a trial run for, the next thing.
Yeah.
That's super creepy.
Yeah, so they knew from these experiments that they funded that they could get away with a whole lot. They could get a majority of people to believe in a preposterous story and do inhumane things to their fellow men and women.
Well, also, what year were the Milgram experiments? Like, was it when we were allegedly operating under Smith-Mundt? Isn't the CIA supposed to be doing international fuckery, not fuckery on its own people within our own borders?
Yeah, well, when you start going there, again, it becomes, this is another part of the psychology of non-perception. It's obvious. There's so many things that the CIA has been caught doing, which are against their charter, which is, as an international espionage organization, not supposed to operate on American soil. But all these things they did operate on American soil, including, launching the psychedelic thing in the 1950s.
And not to mention the fact that no one seems to have the problem that they haven't released the Kennedy assassination files, even though that's totally illegal at this point. It's just like another realm of non-perception of like, oh, look, the intelligence agencies are breaking another law. Everything's fine.
Yeah. So let me now mention the next kind of pillar of the psychology of non-perception, which is the theory of cognitive dissonance.
Yep.
Okay. So the theory of cognitive dissonance is right up there with Solomon Asch as the most researched concept in contemporary social psychology.
Mm-hmm.
And the theory of cognitive dissonance just states very simply that a normal person with normal self-esteem is not comfortable holding two dissonant ideas. And so they will either not perceive or they will rationalize in order to ease the dissonance.
Hold up. How are we defining a normal person?
Well, a normal person, just in terms of modern psychological metrics, they administer personality tests and there are, scores. These are, non-psychotic, again, a lot, college students at some of the best. The theory of cognitive dissonance was developed at Stanford University.
Well, are they only testing dumb people? Because the definition of intelligence by certain metrics is the ability to hold opposing ideas and not need them resolved. So are we talking about people of below average intelligence?
No, we're talking about people really, and again, this is a theory that's been looked at a lot of different ways. So there are many, many studies, and these important questions that you're asking are answered. I don't have my fingers on the data now, but just like Solomon Asch's conformity studies, higher self-esteem, more creative individuals, artistic types, are perfectly comfortable holding dissonant cognitions. In fact, they thrive on it.
Mm-hmm.
And so, that's what we're talking about, but just normal people.
Okay.
Intelligence is not really the question. It has more to do with a certain cognitive style and tolerance for ambiguity and
what's coming up for me, and I don't want to waylay the conversation or the track that we're on right now, is just like how many people on this planet are actually people. It just has me questioning if we're all the same or if these are just like the holograms being used to pass for people or something. But please continue.
Well, it would be fun to go down that rabbit hole sometime too, because I go there too. I think that it's a mistake to think of Homo sapiens as a homogeneous species, that there's a great variety of us here. And whether that's because we're been hybridized and have different extraterrestrial forebears or what, but the differences in personality style and in cognitive style are so extraordinary. I think we need to come up with paint this picture with a finer brush, that we're not just Homo sapiens. There's Homo empath, there's Homo domineers, there's Homo greed. There are people. And when I was raising my son, it was so incredible. One day I took him to daycare, and then a bunch of little 3-year-olds. And they're so different. Some are just naturally compassionate and want to share their stuff. Others are, trying to beat kids up and take their things. And this can't be the result of just their upbringing. They haven't really had that much upbringing yet. They're born with an agenda.
Right.
So back to cognitive dissonance. It's kind of common. We know that, say, a person who'd been subject to childhood sexual abuse by their parents or clergy or teachers, this is a classic example of non-perception. They will repress these memories, act like it never happened, And not until, later on in adult life, whatever, a psychedelic experience, therapy, hypnosis, suddenly these memories will come flooding back into them. So what accounts for this non-perception? This can be explained in terms of the theory of cognitive dissonance, because a person who is a victim of sexual abuse by their parents or their clergy has terrific cognitive dissonance. Mm-hmm. This person loves me. This is the person I depend on for my life. This is my pastor. And they're fucking me. They're abusing me. They're harming me. Those two things do not go together.
Right.
And so they have to erase, repress, not perceive that.
Yep.
Okay. So that's, of course, a hard example. But when you look at, now we'll go back and look at the Kennedy assassination, it's the same thing. So here's the cognitive dissonance that the United States of America, the greatest country in the world. We've all been hypnotized since we were little children to believe, to put our hand over our heart. This is literally a hypnotic induction. Put your hand over your heart and pledge allegiance to the flag. I can remember being a little kid. I was born in Boston. We have the American spirit. We're so fucking great. We're the greatest country in the world. One nation under God, indivisible, liberty and justice for all. We're that shining city on the hill. We're the best. This concept of American exceptionalism is so ingrained in every single child in this country. Every day of their life until they're, whatever they are, 18 years old, right? It's required that used to be required that you put your hand on your heart and you recite the pledge. They changed that when I was in high school, I think.
We did it.
Yeah.
I was required to do that every morning, but I never thought America is the greatest. I thought, why am I saying under God when there's this stipulation in the Constitution of separation in church and state? I feel like my rights are being trampled. And then I started writing letters to the politicians.
Yeah, well, you're trouble. And I'm sure that's been pointed out before.
I don't know what you're talking about.
So think of that. And I mean, look at the history of the Pledge of Allegiance, right? That used to be where you had to hold your hand out like this with your palm down. They only changed that in World War II. They thought, oh no, it's a little too close to the Hitler's salute. And they said, put it over your heart instead.
Have you ever looked up like the ancient spiritual mudra and what this means in terms of like spiritual technology of our bodies?
No, tell me.
No, I don't know. I'm curious.
Yeah, no, that's very fascinating because we're having this conversation as if the mind control apparatus started, what are we saying, Solomon Asch in the 30s, but this goes way, way back. I mean, this is elites or oligarchs controlling populations is as old as the history of civilization.
Right.
So, and so that's, that's the basic setup that we have, is that it becomes very, very difficult for someone to believe, to go against their hypnotic induction.
And do you think, or in your research know, that the mandatory recitation of the Pledge of Allegiance was a deliberate mind control attempt?
I'm not sure about that yet.
Okay.
Joe Atwill knows more about that.
And it would be interesting to figure out the origin of that. And
it was first written by a fellow named Bellamy in the early part of the last century.
Okay.
Became instituted, and then, like I said, there were a few different changes in phrasing, and then during World War II, they changed the Heil part to hand over, and what that person's what his affiliations were, what secret societies, was he a Freemason? That would be something to ask Joe or dig into. I don't really know that yet.
What's the guy's name? Bellamy?
Yeah, Bellamy.
Okay.
Bellamy. It's not Edward Bellamy, but it's Bellamy. And he was just, he was a journalist, actually, I think, an East Coast journalist who concocted this Pledge of Allegiance.
I mean, it would be interesting to see if there, I have obviously done no research, but I'm wondering where's the Rockefeller Tie, because they had their grubby hands in curriculum at that time. So how would a journalist be able to institute something on such a mass scale? I don't know. I'll need to look into it. I'm curious.
Yeah. So those are two of the real big pillars, the three. And then the other thing is, again, this concept of American exceptionalism. Right, that's an interesting set of concepts, and here we need to bring in one of the arch villains, Henry Luce.
Okay.
Who I think you and I might have spoken about him a little bit before. Henry Luce was a very, very powerful man in American culture in the in the middle of the last century. Henry Luce, he was the founder and publisher and editor, ran the whole Time Life media conglomerate.
Yep.
He was a Skull and Bones member. He was, according to Timothy Leary, Henry Luce was the person singularly responsible for the propagation of psychedelic drugs in America.
Because of the article on the mushrooms that he ran in, was it Time?
Life. That was the first thing. Mm-hmm. But then there were dozens of books and other media coverage, all in enterprises that he controlled. And there's a great book for anybody that's taking notes and is literary and literate as I am, that is called Acid Hype.
Okay.
Acid Hype by a media scholar, Professor Stephen Siff at the University of Wisconsin, I believe. The book is Acid Hype, the American media and the psychedelic experience, and he it's his PhD and now a book showing again the explosion of interest in psychedelic drugs were mainly through Henry Luce controlled publications, either books or magazines and so on like that.
Mm-hmm. Interesting.
Well, Henry Luce also, I think it was 1934. He wrote an essay in Life magazine that revived this concept of American exceptionalism. Mm-hmm. And the title of the article was The American Century.
Okay.
But the purpose of that article was to give Americans an excuse and help justify the imperialistic activities of the American military throughout South America, that we had to do, because we were so special, we have to go overseas and spread democracy and freedom. We have to do this. And it's really something to read this article, The American Century. And you probably know that the important white classified document, the project Rebuilding America's Defenses, yep, and the project for the new American century is named after Henry Luce's 1934 paper. So they accomplished the last century. And then 9/11 was the new American century. We need a galvanizing event. And then, you look at all the memes that were used to, advance the wars after 9/11. Like, we have to go, help these people. This is our duty. And so, Americans, 70 to 80% of Americans are placed in this position of terrific cognitive dissonance, having been hypnotized. We're in the same position as a person that's, been abused by their church.
Yep.
Can't quite see it. They just can't quite see it. And so, and then you can trace it in the media, how, certain memes are hammered. Like, as soon as someone gets out of the box, and that person is ostracized. Remember that famous case of, I'm forgetting his name, the handsome Black man with a political look very shining light, was going to be involved in the Obama administration. He signed a petition for 9/11. Oh shit, what was his name? I'll come back to it. But those are some of the broad strokes of this psychology of non-perception and why it is impossible for people to see these